A research team points a laser scanner at a granite wall in Aswan, Egypt. Within minutes, the device captures a full three-dimensional map of every curve groove and scoop mark carved into the stone thousands of years ago. Then an AI model gets to work on that data, comparing thousands of measurements, simultaneously hunting for patterns no human eye could reasonably catch. Just walking through the quarry with a notebook, what comes back isn't a wild theory. It's something more interesting, real measurable evidence. That the old simple explanation for how these marks were made might not be the whole story. This is the story of the Aswan quarries, the strange scoop marks that have puzzled archaeologists for more than a century, and what happens when 3D scanning and AI-based analysis finally get pointed at one of Egypt's oldest unsolved puzzles. Aswan sits on the banks of the Nile in southern Egypt, hundreds of miles south of Cairo. For thousands of years, this region supplied granite for some of Egypt's most iconic structures. Temples, statues, obelisks, and elements of the pyramids all trace back to stone pulled from these quarries. Granite in soft rock. It sits between 6 and 7 on the Mohs. Hardness scale, harder than most of the metal tools available in the ancient world. Cutting it, shaping it, and moving it would have been an enormous undertaking no matter how it was done, which alone should earn ancient quarry workers more credit than they usually get. The most famous feature at the site is the unfinished obelisk, a massive single block of granite still attached to the bedrock, abandoned partway through construction after cracks appeared in the stone. Completed, it would have weighed close to 1,000 tons, making it one of the largest single stone objects ever attempted by human hands in the ancient world. Around this obelisk run deep trenches, and the walls of those trenches are covered in mysterious scoop marks that have drawn attention from researchers for generations. These scoops run roughly 6 to 8 inches wide and 2 to 4 inches deep, curving in smooth, repeating arcs, layered into close, overlapping rows that create a rippled, almost wave-like texture across the stone. Touch them and they feel smooth, not jagged, not cracked, not fractured. The way you'd expect from stone struck repeatedly with another rock. That smoothness is exactly what has kept this mystery alive for so long. For decades, the standard explanation has been straightforward. Workers used handheld balls of dolerite, a stone harder than granite, to pound the surface again and again until material broke away. Over time, thousands of small impacts would carve out these curved depressions. It's a theory that makes sense on paper, and archaeologists have actually tested it in the field, not just argued about it in books. That's where the story gets complicated. When modern experiments recreate the dolerite pounding method, the results don't quite match what's carved into the walls at Aswan. Pounding tends to produce rough, irregular pits, edges fracture unevenly, and depths vary from strike to strike, because no human arm swings with perfectly identical force every single time, especially not for hours on end, day after day. The marks at Aswan, by contrast, show remarkably little variation across large areas. Researchers have noted the difference for decades, but without a reliable way to measure it precisely across an entire quarry wall. It remained more of an observation than a documented anomaly. People noticed, it mentioned it in passing, and moved on since there wasn't a practical way to quantify just how consistent these marks really were. This is exactly where digital scanning shifts things. Over the past several years, teams working in Egypt have started using laser scanners and photogrammetry, a technique that stitches together thousands of overlapping photographs into a precise three-dimensional digital model to document quarry sites in far greater detail than any camera and measuring tape ever allowed. Instead of relying purely on the human eye, researchers can now capture the exact geometry of every scoop mark across an entire trench wall, every curve, depth, and angle of entry, recorded down to fractions of a millimeter, and stored digitally so it can be studied again and again without ever touching the original stone. Once that kind of dataset exists, AI-based pattern analysis becomes possible. This isn't an AI system inventing facts or handing down a verdict from nothing. It's a tool built to process enormous sets of measurements far faster and more consistently than a person manually comparing marks with a ruler and a notepad. Feed thousands of scanned scoop marks into software designed for statistical pattern recognition, and it can flag unexpected uniformity, repeating spacing intervals, or geometric consistency that would be extraordinarily difficult for a human researcher to spot, just by walking wall to wall and eyeballing the stone. That's exactly what has some researchers intrigued right now. Early digital surveys of sections of the Aswan trenches have found that many of the scoop marks are far more consistent in size and spacing than random hand tool percussion would typically produce. Not machine tolerance. Perfect, but consistent enough to raise legitimate questions about how much of this work was purely freehand pounding and how much may have involved some kind of guided or templated technique that has been fully identified. Yet perhaps a wooden or stone guide that steadied the swing, or perhaps a technique passed down and refined across generations of specialized quarry workers producing a level of muscle memory precision that modern one-off lab experiments haven't managed to replicate over a few weeks. It's worth being very clear about what this does and doesn't mean. It does not mean the marks were made by lasers, drills, or powered machinery. No trace of ancient electricity, no diamond-tipped industrial tooling, and no evidence of anything resembling modern cutting technology has ever been found in Egypt, and no credible 3D scan or AI analysis claims. Otherwise, what it does mean is that the old simplified explanation that workers pounded randomly until stone broke away might not capture the full picture. There may have been more method, more skill, and more consistency in ancient Egyptian stonework than that simplified story gives credit for. Now consider the deep test pits, which are just as strange and just as poorly explained by the traditional story. Scattered around the quarries are narrow vertical shafts cut straight down into solid granite, some reaching 30 to 50 feet deep, while only 3 to 4 feet wide. The traditional explanation is that these were exploratory pits dug to check the quality of the stone below the surface before committing to a large extraction project reasonable enough on its face, since quarry workers in every era want to know if the stone they're about to invest months of labor into is solid or riddled with hidden cracks. But picture actually cutting one of these by hand and the practical problems pile up fast. Imagine being 40 feet down a shaft, only 3 feet wide, barely room to swing your arms, let alone a heavy stone hammer with any real force behind it. Dust fills the air with nowhere to escape. Light is minimal, and every basket of broken stone chips would need to be hauled up and out over and over for the entire depth of the shaft. Recent 3D mapping of a number of these pits has added another layer to the puzzle. In several cases, the shafts don't cut in a perfectly straight vertical line. They curve slightly as they descend, following natural mineral veins or weaknesses inside the granite that aren't visible from the surface at all. That detail suggests the people cutting these shafts had some way of anticipating what was happening inside the rock, whether through generations of hard-earned practical experience, reading subtle surface clues, or some method of testing that hasn't been identified in the archaeological record. Either way, it represents a level of practical geological awareness that doesn't get much attention in the standard, simplified account of ancient quarry work. There's also the matter of wall quality. In a hand-dug shaft, workmanship generally gets rougher the deeper it goes, since conditions worsen with depth. Less light, less air, more fatigue, and more difficulty. Controlling tools with precision. But scans of several Aswan test pits show wall quality, staying fairly consistent from top to bottom. It's a small, easy-to-miss detail, but exactly the kind digital scanning is good at catching one that easily slips past a quick visual inspection during a site visit. None of this proves some hidden advanced technology was involved, but it does mean the quick exploratory pit dug in an afternoon. Explanation doesn't fully capture what's actually preserved in the stone, a gap worth taking seriously rather than glossing over. Then there's the depression in the southern part of the quarry complex, an area long identified by archaeologists as an ancient harbor or loading zone where finished stone blocks were supposedly moved toward the Nile for transport downriver. Some researchers who've studied the shape and volume of this depression using digital terrain models have proposed an alternative reading that its dimensions look less like a harbor and more like the empty cavity left behind after an enormous single block of stone was cut and removed in one piece. If that interpretation holds up under further study, it implies a block that could have weighed several thousand tons, dwarfing anything Egypt is confirmed to have successfully quarried and transported elsewhere. Worth being honest, here this idea remains genuinely debated, not settled, and the harbor explanation is still the mainstream, more widely accepted view among Egyptologists. But it's a legitimately interesting open question, exactly the kind that better 3D survey data, combined with careful geological modeling, may eventually help resolve. Now for one of the most debated pieces of evidence at the site, the red ochre paintings. In several spots throughout the Aswan quarries, there are simple reddish drawings on the granite surfaces, images of birds, boats in geometric shapes done in a style that closely resembles prehistoric rock art found elsewhere across the Sahara and the wider Nile Valley. That artistic style is generally associated with a period thousands of years before the start of dynastic Egypt, long before the first pharaohs. Here's the detail that has sparked so much discussion in at least a few documented locations. This paint appears to sit inside the grooves of the scoop marks, meaning the scoop had to be cut into the stone before the paint was applied on top of it. If that layering holds up under closer, more rigorous examination, it raises a genuinely fascinating timeline question, since it would suggest at least some of this stone-cutting work predates the paintings themselves, and by extension, may be considerably older than the dynastic period. Most of the quarry's work is normally attributed to "it's important to stay careful and grounded." Here, dating rock art precisely as genuinely difficult style alone is a reliable method for pinning down an exact age, and the paint-over-scoop relationship has been confirmed consistently across the entire site, only in specific documented locations. Some archaeologists think these could be later additions layered onto older cut marks for symbolic or ritual reasons, not necessarily proof of some vastly older lost civilization. Others believe it deserves serious, dedicated dating work using modern chemical and stratigraphic methods, since this kind of layering, if verified more broadly across the site, would genuinely challenge the standard timeline in a meaningful way. Right now, it sits as an open, actively contested question rather than a settled fact, and any honest account of this site has to say that, plainly, rather than dressing it up as proof. So where does this actually leave us? We have scoop marks that are more geometrically consistent, once properly measured with 3D scanning, then basic dolerite pounding experiments have been able to reproduce under controlled conditions. We have deep test pits showing a level of planning, internal awareness, and structural consistency that's hard to fully explain with a quick, rough digging process. We have a depression whose true shape might represent the largest single stone extraction ever attempted anywhere in the ancient world, or might simply be an old harbor, depending on which researcher and which site model you trust. And we have prehistoric style paintings that, in at least some documented places, appear to sit directly on top of cutting marks whose true age isn't fully settled. None of this is proof of ancient super technology hidden from history. It isn't evidence of some mythical civilization armed with power tools centuries before their supposed invention. What it is a genuine ongoing scientific puzzle, one that's finally getting sharper now that researchers have the right tools to measure it properly for the first time. For more than 100 years, people studied these marks, mostly by eye by hand with rough field sketches and black and white photographs. Now, with high-resolution 3D scanning, capturing every curve and every millimeter of depth across entire quarry walls and AI-assisted analysis, able to process that data at a scale no individual researcher could manage in a lifetime, patterns that were always there, just too subtle and too spread out to notice, without the right instruments, are finally coming into view. That's really the heart of the story. It's not that ancient Egyptians secretly had lasers or hidden machinery. It's that our tools for studying them have finally started to catch up to the actual complexity of what they built with their hands. The dolerite pounding explanation isn't necessarily wrong at its core, but it may well be incomplete. Maybe there were guiding techniques or specialized tools we haven't fully identified in the archaeological record. Maybe skilled hands working generation after generation within a dedicated class of quarry. Specialists developed a level of practiced precision that modern, one-off experimental attempts simply haven't matched over a few weeks of trial and error. And maybe some marks really do belong to an earlier period than commonly assumed, in which case the paint layering evidence deserves a serious, rigorous, well-funded dating effort rather than being dismissed outright, or at the other extreme oversold as definitive proof of a lost civilization. What makes this genuinely exciting isn't some dramatic, sensational reveal or shocking secret exposed after centuries of cover-up. It's that archaeology is entering a phase where digital tools let researchers ask sharper, better informed questions of sites people thought they already understood completely. Every trench wall at Aswan can now, in principle, be turned into a precise digital twin preserved forever, regardless of weathering or damage to the original stone. Every scoop mark can be measured, compared side by side, and cross-referenced against thousands of others in a matter of seconds, rather than years of manual fieldwork. Patterns that might have taken a researcher an entire career to notice by eye alone can now surface in days, simply because the data can finally be processed at scale.